Hello, welcome to this expert panel discussion of what the British Army should do with its tanks. So I'm delighted to welcome three other British experts, some users, some analytical experts. So everybody, thank you for doing this with us. It's a service to my students and it's a service to the general public. And I appreciate you being here with me to talk about this subject. So we're in curious times, so I'll just set up the context, the motivation for having this panel discussion. So last month, August of 2020, there was a leak from the Ministry of Defence of a supposed plan for the British Army to delete its remaining maiden battle tanks from service. So delete them from service. Actually, the story was they would go into storage. And then just over 2 weeks later, the Secretary of Defence denied that there was a plan to withdraw all tanks, although he admitted that likely some would be withdrawn and a remainder would be upgraded. That was a sort of promise he made, although it took more than 2 weeks to get that out. So the first question we have is, what is the MOD really thinking? We've got two of you, Nicholas and James, who have more regular contact with the MOD than the rest of us. So if I could ask you to try to answer the question from your social network, we can keep it anonymous, but what is the MOD really thinking about particularly its main battle tanks or its heavy armor more generally? And Nicholas, could I start with you, please?
Thank you very much for having me today, Bruce. It's great on this panel. The fundamental issue that the MOD is wrestling with is how does it make the army deployable? And we had the bulk of the army stationed in Germany for 50 years, and it stayed there. And while it was there, it was very difficult for it to do anything else. That was fine when we had a single threat, which was the Soviet Union at that time. But now we're faced with multiple threats. We just don't know where we're going to end up. It could be Africa, it could be Asia, it could be the Baltics, Middle East, who knows? And therefore we need an army that's much more expeditionary by design. And that really takes the emphasis away from heavy armor because it's so difficult to deploy. So I don't think they just want to get rid of tanks for the sake of it, even though there are sort of question marks that hang over the capability itself. But it's just its recognition that we must be able to get to where we're needed quickly.
Yeah, James, can you add to that?
I mean, I certainly agree. That's a key challenge. I think the other thing to add is that this is an argument that's playing out at multiple levels. So, we're in the midst of an integrated review of foreign policy, defence policy, development policy, security policy. So going much wider in scope than a traditional defence review, which is already, a very big deal and something that consumes a lot of the MOD's kind of analytical effort and internal kind of inter-service rivalries for a couple of years at a time, each time they do one. But supposedly this is a kind of all-encompassing review looking at the UK's place after Brexit in the world and what the global Brexit kind of slogan is actually going to look like in reality as a strategic actor. And so you've got an argument going on within government about the apportion of funds to the MOD versus other parts of Whitehall, an argument which has been made even more difficult and complicated after COVID and both the kind of ongoing public health crisis that brings along, but also clearly the wider economic and fiscal crisis that implies. So there's a real challenge around defence spending. What's that going to look like? And I know the Secretary of State has been obviously campaigning hard to protect that, and the Prime Minister said at the liaison committee yesterday that they were still looking to live up to the lock around increasing above inflation. But clearly, just how much of the pie defence is going to get is a big argument in itself. And then once you get past that argument, you've then got the argument about, okay, well, where does that go within the military? And you get the usual kind of inter-service rivalries. You get the RAF, the Navy, the new Strategic Command, and the Army, obviously each arguing that they have very relevant capabilities and forces that can do, X, Y, Z, and you really must continue to invest in them. But there's also this broader kind of challenge that the MOD and the armed forces face at the moment, which is they have real pressure from Number 10. There's a lot in the news about Dominic Cummings and his views on defence and defence spending and how that has been done or not done so well over the years. So they've got this real tension about justifying what it is they do, addressing an increasingly wide and complex range of threats in different theatres, both above and below the kind of threshold of open armed conflict, and at the same time trying to embrace new technology whilst maintaining kind of legacy systems or update them and continue to make them relevant, which is of course what we're starting to talk about when we talk about tanks. So there's kind of all these different threads coming together, and main battle tanks have emerged as one of the kind of the obvious candidates for a debate, but also something that's very emotive because they're a very kind of physical, tangible, obvious manifestation of the state's kind of ambition to be a military power in the land domain. And they're also something that obviously the British Army has a unique history with, going back to World War One.
Yeah, so thank you. Let me push you on what the MOD might have been really thinking about tanks. So I'm just looking at another screen here just to give the full story. So 25th of August, the leak was that the MOD had a plan to withdraw into storage all tanks. And at the time I read that on the day, I interpreted that as, it had a plan. It had this was one of the options. It was an option. It wasn't a plan to actually execute this withdrawal. It was an option that was being considered with a number of other options. And maybe it was at the extreme end of the options and it wasn't a popular option. The leak or the reporting did not tell us. So my interpretation was that was an option. But I did find it quite curious that it took more than 2 weeks for the Defence Secretary to deny that there was a plan to withdraw all tanks. And he came out and said this publicly in an interview only after the chairs of two select committees had criticised the option. So I'll read out. The chair of the Defence Select Committee, that's Tobias Ellwood, said, "I don't see a defence strategy here. I see a cost-cutting exercise. We need to be asking what role do we want Britain to play in the world before we make decisions about land warfare." New sentence, mass matters, and our presence with tanks and armoured personnel carriers will be respected by Russia. So Tobias Ellwood has been very vocal about the threat from Russia in Europe in particular. And then after that, the chair of the Intelligence Security Committee, Julian Lewis, criticized, quote, reckless and irrational and strategically illiterate timing of an integrated review during the COVID emergency, and suspected the emergency as being used as cover for deep cuts. So given that the Defense Secretary spoke after that, then I thought, oh, maybe the MOD was considering withdrawing all tanks much more seriously than I first thought. And it took this sort of criticism to get the Defense Secretary to deny it. So I guess my question is, how seriously was the MOD considering withdrawing all tanks? How serious an option is that? Does anybody know?
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, go ahead.
So what has become very apparent is that the original Army 2025 plan is not affordable, because if you have all the vehicles and support costs associated with operating them in service, you don't have any money left for other important things like new artillery, like cyber, like new C4I systems, and so on. So the plan had become overheated. I think it was said recently that they've spent 2.75 billion on vehicles, with only 6 Ajax delivered so far, out of a total of about 1,000 vehicles that are expected to enter service. So a real concern about how do we afford the army of the future. So, in proposing the reduction in tanks, I think what was really happening there was they were trying to see what the reaction would be, because it's not just a strategic decision, it's a political decision. They want to get re-elected. It was a rather cynical way to look at it, perhaps, but that is the reality.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that it's always hard if you're, a minister during a defence review or an integrated review in this case, of to what extent do you kind of play whack-a-mole with leaks, or to what extent do you kind of ignore them? Because we get this even outside of review cycles. You get stories about certain ships or whatever coming towards the end of their life. Will they be replaced or not. You get a strong lobby from industry, but obviously also from the relevant service and from the local community that is around a base or a particular part of the country that, you know, that capability is important to. And that creates this little political furore. And as you say, there's an important kind of domestic political angle to that. And it can be hard if you're a minister, obviously, during a review, to the extent to which you kind of feed that, or just kind of step back and say, well, you know, we're looking at the whole force mix. I'm not going to comment on individual decisions as we go, because clearly it's not just about whether it's tanks or no tanks. It's tanks, fewer tanks, artillery, more cyber, more space, more of the other, all these other things they need to square in the budget. The other angle to it, of course, is international politics. So clearly, you know, it's also about seeing how other allies and partners respond. There's a real question about what the UK's role should be in NATO. Should we kind of specialize in certain areas? Should we continue to be a kind of small kind of pocket version of the US in terms of trying to have ambitions for full spectrum capabilities? So where do we play in? And main battle tanks are, you know, an obvious example there, where, as has been said, they're really quite difficult to get to the places that you would want to use them. There's a time lag to that. And so, you know, unless the UK is willing to invest in all the wider enablers, you know, that may or may not be credible to its allies, and similarly may or may not be credible to its adversaries. So I think, you know, it's in that context that it does take a while to come to these kind of comments in public, let alone the decisions within Whitehall.
Right. Paddy?
Well, I think Nicholas encapsulated the decision that the MOD is trying to make fairly well in the opening statement. Either we have an expeditionary capability or we don't. And if we're going to have one, we can either go with heavy armour and fight major wars against near peer and peer levels. And let's not forget, we currently have an armoured battle group sitting in the Baltics there to deter Mr. Putin from going a little thing. Or we say, well, we can't afford the tanks. Well, if you can't afford the tanks, you're then off to doing armoured warfare without tanks. And as we might come to, that's quite a dangerous thing to be going on with. And I think within the Army context of this, the Armour Corps has never had any friends. Army 2020 was at the time being postulated as a way of keeping a little bit of all capability for a time when, given the boom that was then anticipated, we could then have some regeneration and reconstitution and answer all the right questions. I mean, the current problem is we have 5 warrior battalions, 3 tank regiments, which we're somehow calling 3 armoured brigades, although it's about a brigade and a half of the old money Cold War armoured brigades. And we've got over 28 dismounted infantry battalions. A dismounted infantryman goes to war on his feet just the same as he did in 1914, and against a decent enemy he dies like flies just the same as he did in 1914, which is why I invented armoured warfare anyway. And so in the process of all the various post-bust defence cuts and rationalisation and more cuts, too many cans have been kicked down the road. I think the hope is that they can somehow get through this one without a Conservative Prime Minister actually having to come to the British public saying, do you know what, we don't do every level of warfare anymore. Internationally, I think that also has a thing. I mean, we did actually perform pretty well in Gulf 1, Gulf 2, and we turned up in Afghanistan and certainly shed our share of blood. There aren't that many countries that have credible current armoured capabilities to fight high intensity warfare. On a stroppy day, I would argue that we are very much at the margin of that at the moment. But the group think that, well, if we get rid of the tanks, everything else will be fine. Well, what are you going to do with a warrior? What the hell is a warrior going to do if it comes around the corner and bumps into a T-72? I'll tell you now, it will die horribly. And its recently upgraded or being upgraded gun will damage the paint of one of Vlad's vehicles. But, you know, it's not going to happen. It's not going to work. And the other thing people forget is it's not just the tanks and the armoured personnel carriers. In Gulf War I, we had to go and buy at short notice a whole load of armoured logistics vehicles so that we could move the motion potion and the ammunition of what was technically known as the hard A1 echelon, because you couldn't do it on trucks, because in the Gulf, in the Cold War scenarios, we'd got used to fighting on our own lines of supply. Expeditionary warfare shouldn't be easy, I would argue. It's very easy to get into a battle or a war. It's a bloody sight harder to get out. And I think it is a myth to say, okay, we'll have lovely light vehicles and we'll stick them into our lovely, well, both our Hercules, all four of our C-17s, phone up the parachute regiment, and we'll go and do an airdrop or whatever, and that'll all sort itself out. It won't. The consumption of combat supplies, even in medium and low intensity conflicts, is horrendous. And all that needs shipping, and all that's heavy. And I think that the interventionist mindset that developed when the Cold War went off the agenda so people could perhaps take geopolitical and military risks has led to some very ill-conceived and poorly executed operations, not least because of weak logistics. And I think the debate, so I finished, I spoke too long, the debate that the MOD has to have with the country is, what do we actually want to do? And where is our national interest? And the army needs to start getting a lot more sensible about what force mix it wants. I have no idea why we have a cyber warfare brigade in the army, but that's for another day.
Yeah, well, no, thank you, Paddy. So we're already talking about what the MOD should do. It's implicit in what we're already talking about. So let's get into that. I think, as to segue nicely, I think there's a couple of items I think we need to address. One is, as Paddy mentioned at the end there, should the army, should tanks be competing within the army with cyber and space capabilities, which is what was implied in the leak on 25th of August, and has been confirmed by the Defence Secretary. He said we will probably, so he used the word probably, we'll probably need to have less tanks so that we can have other things like offensive cyber capabilities and even space capabilities. And from an American perspective, this is my American Bruce talking. That seems really strange because the US military has just separated a space command. And it's, right, the Air Force had charge for a while of space, not the Army. And the Air Force has separated that as a new service. It's not even in the traditional services. So there's a separate Space Command, then there's a separate Cyber Command, which is with the National Security Agency. So it's sort of mixed military civilian, and the primary military expertise is also with the Air Force, US Air Force in cyber. So the first item is, should the Army's tanks be competing with cyber and space at all? I mean, clearly Britain wants to improve its cyber and space capabilities, but then shouldn't it be investing outside the Army? That's the first item. And then the second is about money. We always hear, we've got to sacrifice tanks, but tanks as a platform, tanks are not that expensive. They cost a few millions of pounds. They get over 10 million pounds. That's an expensive tank. And they're competing in the loose talk I'm seeing in the news media, they're competing with fighter planes that cost hundreds of millions and naval platforms that cost billions, which seems unfair. That seems like an unfair, an unfair competition, right? You're not going to save that much from tanks. I know there are then the savings you make by cutting the whole logistical train and the combatant force mix that helps to make up a heavy armored brigade or formation, division, whatever it is. But tanks, as platform for platform, tanks are not expensive. So so I guess there's two questions about fairness here. Is it fair for tanks to compete with cyber and space? That's number one. And secondly, is it fair for tanks to compete in the budget with other weapon platforms primarily used by the Navy and Air Force? Anybody?
I mean, I think I'd start by questioning the premise of whether fairness is a major criteria for how inter-service rivalries and so on play out. I certainly take. I mean, I think I take both your points. I mean, on the point about space and cyber. I mean, clearly the UK is kind of quite rapidly evolving its thinking on both of those domains. The UK has recognised them as operational domains for longer than NATO has as an alliance. Could only recognise cyber in 2016 and then space in 2019. But it's still an area that very much kind of will playing catch up on just thinking through concepts of operations and command control structures and who has responsibility for what and so on. And certainly there's been, you know, on space, there's kind of ongoing arguments about how much of that should sit with the RAF, should sit with joint, what used to be Joint Force Command, now is called Strategic Command. Cyber, obviously, you have in the UK, you have the kind of complicating factor of the overlap with GCHQ. So there's the kind of civilian military angle to it. And there's you know, the kind of at the strategic level, all of that is still playing out. At a lower level, I mean, it's interesting to look at what other armies that the UK kind of refers to are doing, and obviously the US Army has got this multi-domain operations concept. Similarly, the US Air Force has got, you know, its version of multi-domain, and they're all kind of working together on new joint warfare fighting concepts in the US. And those are very much predicated on the idea that you start to erode the distinctions between the services, between commands, between HQs, and you start to have kind of low-level commanders who can draw on sensors and effectors in all sorts of different domains. And we're starting to see actually the Russians doing that with their kind of battalion tactical groups in Ukraine and elsewhere. They're starting to, you know, have a relatively low-level commander bring together tanks, artillery, UAVs, electronic warfare capabilities, offensive cyber, and doing all sorts of kind of smart, clever things to fix and confuse and then destroy, you know, Ukrainian positions. So there is a real kind of difficult question, I think, not just about how do you trade off between things like tanks, cyberspace, etc., but more importantly, how do you integrate all of that so that you're not making a series of kind of siloed decisions about capabilities that don't then fit together as part of a useful force mix.
I have a slightly sort of different view on that. When you start talking about cyber warfare, hybrid warfare, and electronic warfare, you're talking about operations below the threshold of conflict. You're talking about soft power. And I don't think traditionally that is an army role. It's more a GCHQ role. It's even a security services role. And I don't think the army is equipped to do that in terms of the personnel it currently has. And secondly, you know, as part of that, if it is to be equipped to do that, it will need a different type of soldier, a hacker. And you know, hackers and computer experts don't traditionally fit into the expected military mold. The other aspect of it is actually what the army really exists to do is to provide hard power. And that is, we've got to go in and sort out a problem using force. And that to me is its primary role. And as soon as you get it to take on other responsibilities, you diminish its power to perform that most important thing, which is situation. So I think you have to be very careful about doing that. I think part of it is the army's looking for more of a peacetime role, and that's justifiable. But if it's sucking up huge amounts of budget, then that's not sustainable, and we need to rethink it.
I mean, one thing just to pick up very quickly on something you said there is I importantly don't think there need necessarily be a really hard and fast distinction between capabilities for hard power and soft power in some instances. I mean, a good example is Armour. So, I mean, you look at what the Russians did in Eastern Ukraine, and there's a lot written about, you know, special operations forces, deniable activities, and cyber and so on. But actually, that was all backed by having, you know, heavy armor, heavy artillery en masse across the border, which means that there's this kind of latent threat that if the Ukrainians or if the US or Europeans or anyone else who goes in and supports the Ukrainians respond in a certain way, then the Russians can kind of, you know, violently overreact as they need to. So I don't think it's the case that tanks are necessarily not usul for some of that stuff as well.
I hear that point, but what you have the Russians doing in Ukraine is completely unacceptable by our own standards of morality. So going into towns, finding out who the local politicians are, kidnapping their families and using them to achieve their military goals through basically criminal activities. So as soon as you start doing those kind of operations below the threshold, there's a great risk of losing your moral authority. And I think that's
absolutely.
the area that makes me very nervous about us getting into. Because when you commit hard power forces, then it's sort of a different situation. But even then, we're going to be bound by the laws of armed conflict.
Indeed, but trying to catch that. I mean, the point of the army, particularly, and the combat bits of the army, like the infantrymen like Nicholas or Panzer people like me, is they will come and park their tanks on your lawn. They will stand there with a bayonet and say, "You are Her Majesty's enemy, kindly go away or face the consequences." And that's the bit that only soldiers can do. And it seems to me that in a time of constrained budgets, it's foolish to focus on bits that other people could do. Quite a lot of cyber doesn't need someone who is capable of passing a combat fitness test or can shoot straight, or is happy to put his life online. So I can see why the army's grabbed it as a, yes, this is something we can do that doesn't involve moving huge amounts of metal and raining death and destruction everywhere, but it's not core. The all-arms concept, however, is core, and clearly part of that has always been a rapid dissemination of intelligence, the rapid gaining and sharing of information, whether that's from cyber or from anywhere else. But, and again, it depends what sort of war you're fighting. If you're in a maneuver war, that information cycle and decision cycle necessarily has to be very fast. And if you give commanders too much information, they go into overload. And we saw this a lot on some of the FISC concept stuff, which was the future infantry soldier stuff 20 years ago now. The clever bit is getting a guy enough information to enable him to make a decision that's probably right. And if you can execute it quickly and violently, will come out okay. It's not about assessing greater stars. And where additional information becomes useful depends on the size of the formation, what you're doing, where you are. But more information can lead to decision paralysis, and decision paralysis is not good if you're fighting COVID or trying to run an economy, and it's disastrous if you're trying to fight a battle. So I think the army sort of got itself into a bit of a place. I can see how it got there, but when times are hard, what are your core skills? And we all agreed the core skill, the core value in army is don't mess with us, because here's some big heavy metal that you can't cope with.
Yeah,
I mean, you mentioned value there, and of course, Bruce, your second question was kind of around cost, which is the other side of that coin, literally. And you're right. I mean, we are comparing relatively cheap platforms and systems, subsystems that can be upgraded with quite expensive air, maritime, space, and other domain systems. And I think that Patrick made the point earlier around actually there are all the kind of hidden costs that are in many ways more important. It's about having the logistics, it's about having the posture, it's having the skills and the personnel and sufficient numbers and a kind of pipeline of those to keep that over time. It's about having the industrial base that you can then sustain, repair, maintain, upgrade, dispose of these things over time as you need to. And I think you asked why is it that the tanks are kind of in the firing line and some of the other platforms maybe aren't. I mean, an important angle to that as well is at least in my opinion, is the industrial angle. So, the UK has made some pretty big bets spending wise recently in things like combat air. So we've got the Tempest program spending kind of billions of pounds, and that's because you have major companies like BAE Systems, MBDA, Rolls-Royce, Leonardo, and others who work in the UK. And there's a desire within government to level up the economy, level up the regions, invest in high-tech manufacturing, all these sorts of things. And it ticks a lot of boxes. Similarly, there's always a big political debate around any sort of UK acquisition of naval vessels. Should they be built in the UK, principally in Scotland, which then brings in the whole kind of independence union debate. There isn't necessarily the same weight of industrial and kind of domestic political lobbying around the land domain, because we just don't ultimately build as much stuff in the UK as we used to, and that's because we haven't invested over time, and we also don't necessarily see it as at a government level. We don't see it as such a kind of export focus in the way that say combat air is. which is kind of the large share of our defence exports. So I think that's also another important angle. Is it's, you know, if the UK wants to continue to be a credible land domain power, what are the wider kind of industrial and technological and research investments that it needs to make so that it can continue to be credible? Or even if it wants to buy into other countries' programs. So if we want to, you know, in future join a Franco-German program, unless we're just going to turn up with a shed load of money, which we're, you know, that's quite difficult to do, we need to have some interesting intellectual property, some interesting technology, some interesting operational experience using tanks, using these capabilities that we can then bring to the table to get ourselves, you know, a useful share of that. And so I think it's that is something that certainly, you know, there hasn't been for the UK. We've got a shipbuilding strategy, we've got a combat air strategy. There isn't a kind of government, you know, white paper on how we're going to sustain that whole life cycle for the platforms. We're so far from that conversation in the public domain.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I should know there's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in the industrial favor that other platforms have than tanks. So we don't really have a tank industry. I know the MOD is talking about you know, we need to invest in the tank industry we've got, but we actually don't have a main battle tank industry in Britain anymore. That would take major investment. I mean, what we have is sort of a facility that adds some bells and whistles to platforms that are bought abroad and shipped in, and then they're configured for British service, you know. So, and there's a self-fulfilling prophecy to that, because it's been year on year that MOD has plans to upgrade its heavy armor, and the cases in point of Warrior and Challenger 2, and then it actually invests a lot of money and it goes nowhere. So it's very inefficient. So it's not just a choice not to invest in these upgrades. I mean, they waste money on programs that actually don't deliver anything. So there's a self-fulfilling prophecy where you end up with vehicles that get declared obsolete, and then you can justify getting rid of them because they're obsolete, right? So it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Sorry, Paddy, what did you want to say there?
Sorry, just questioning whether it's right. I thought that the Warrior Life Improvement Program was underway.
Yeah, but I just mean the delays to get there. I mean, it's just, I mean, it's a very expensive way to go about it. You have programs that don't deliver, and I know Warrior is finally delivering. Challenger 2 is it going to deliver? We have another postponed decision on narrowing down the competitive bids at the end of 2020. That's what was said last year for the end of 2019 too. So I was just making a point about this self-fulfilling prophecy that you don't invest in heavy armor, and then it's easy to justify getting rid of heavy armor. You don't have the industrial base anymore. You don't. It's now much more expensive to upgrade anything, or in fact, if you want parity, really you're looking at a new platform, which is much more expensive because you've got to make such an incremental step change. Right, so it's a major step change.
I mean, I don't think it couldn't be done. I mean, you've only got to look at the Israelis and the MacArthur, which they built when Harold Wilson cancelled the Chieftain export order, which was been pretty much last export of tanks. So I mean, you could build it from scratch if you knew what you wanted to do and you were going to be buying enough. I think the joy of sort of multinational platforms is that eventually the costs get shared, but usually the project management costs and delays or whatever rather deflate that thing. I mean, famously, you know, BAE Systems will tell you time and time again that Typhoon would have been in service 10 years earlier had the UK fronted up for all the costs which came out as being the same anyway. But the rundown of the UK military has meant that it's not been in BAE Systems' top 5 customers for decades, and the military industrial complex in the UK is largely coincidental and background noise.
Yeah, well, I suppose we should bring Nicholas in at this point, because Nicholas, I know you've written about the economic reality for the British Army. If it wants a new tank or it wants a better tank, it'd be cheaper to buy M1A2s off the shelf, or Leopard 2A7s off the shelf, then certainly cheaper than developing a whole new British tank.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is that, you know, one of the things that's brought a lot of focus on these programs is that they haven't delivered. And you know, there's still no production order for Warrior. It's been in development for 10 years, and still it's not at a point where they can say, okay, here's a production order, give us our 380.
Yeah.
And it's the same with Ajax. That has a production order, and yet after 10 years, only 6 vehicles have been delivered.
Right.
And we don't know when the production for the actual turreted version will begin. So you can see why there's scrutiny. I mean, there's a possibility that we have the integrated review, and that would leave the army in a pretty dire situation. But the more important point to make here is that actually, I don't, as somebody who works in industry, I don't believe we can go it alone in the future. The only way we're going to get a world-class capability is if we do it in partnership with our NATO allies, either America, Germany, France, Italy, whomever, so that the critical mass of vehicles produced is sufficient to bring the cost down, but also to reduce the long-term support costs. And I think what's really killing Challenger is the support costs, because we're the sole user. We have to buy all the spares up front. And when they run out, you know, putting them back into production again is very, very expensive. Whereas you've got an active program like Abrams and Leopard, the spares are constantly being produced, and it brings the costs way down. So we've got to rethink how we buy. We have to do it in partnership, and we also have to have a domestic industry.
And I mean, the key, I agree. And the key question then is, what can UK MOD do as a kind of intelligent customer and as someone who invests not just in capability, but obviously also in R&D programs to kind of promote a kind of Team UK approach to that? Because if you look at a lot of other nations, the national government and the industry will work very closely together in positioning themselves for any negotiations around industrial work share and all these sorts of difficult things that come up when you talk about multinational program. You know, the UK traditionally has had a more kind of arm's length industrial policy, a bit more kind of laissez-faire, certainly not kind of state ownership on kind of en masse in the way that you know, the French, for example, have looked at in the past. And you know, that has certain merits, but equally it means that you just don't necessarily get a kind of joined up approach between government and industry to getting into those multinational programs. And you don't, for example, get the long-term indication from, you know, you mentioned the lack of a Warrior procurement contract. You don't get that kind of long-term certainty from government that is then going to incentivize and free up industry to invest in skills internally, invest in, you know, its own money in new technology. And so you just end up with this kind of stasis, which is not to anyone's best interest. And I think, yeah, if there isn't a kind of long-term clear sense of what it is the UK wants in terms of the capability, what it wants to get out of industrially and economically, and what its kind of priority kind of red lines are for any multinational program, the danger is that you just get, you know, other countries run rings around you when it comes to trying to buy into some sort of multinational program. And that's not where we want to be. And I think there are good lessons you can learn from other domains. You know, we've been doing multinational programs in well and badly in things like aerospace for decades. And certainly we should be trying to learn some of those lessons and not replicate the bad ones when it comes to tanks in future.